What if I told you that the real scandal of the Hungary Grand Prix was not the touch between Verstappen and Hamilton, but what Ferrari could be hiding behind the scenes? Was it really a simple technical decision, or there is something much darker behind all this? The 29th round of the 2025 Hungary Grand Prix was held under a tense climate, but nothing out of the Formula One. However, a few seconds were enough for the race to change radically tone. Max Verstappen, who was tracing positions from the 8th place after a bad classification, arrived as a bullet to the curve 4 of the Hungaroring, taking advantage of a freshest tire set that gave it a clearly superior performance. On the radar he had Lewis Hamilton, who marched at that time in 4th position, trying to manage his rhythm to attack later. What happened next was one of those maneuvers that mark a before and after in a season. Verstappen decided to throw his car inside a fast curve, a point of the circuit where he advances implies risk. And he did without hesitation. With surgical precision, it was placed to the limit of the regulation, forcing Hamilton to decide in second fractions. Either he kept the path and risked a clash, or went to the escape to avoid contact. The British opted for the second and went completely out of the asphalt, joining meters later through the escape zone. The funny thing is that, visually, there was no physical contact. There were no spoilers flying, nor broken pieces, nor yellow flags. But the competitive meaning of that moment was immense. Because what was at stake was not only a position, but the moral leadership between two world champions, now representing rival teams with very different stories. Red Bull seeking to redeem himself after a bad start of the year, and Ferrari still trying to consolidate Hamilton as a figure of technical and sports authority. The commissioner's reaction was even more disconcerting. Instead of investigating the incident immediately as usual in such tight maneuvers, they decided to postpone the review after the race. A decision that quickly fired theories. Why delay something so obvious? Was it because of the complexity of the analysis? By media pressure? Or perhaps for hidden interest? These types of decisions open dangerous cracks in the credibility of the system. Because although the regulation contemplates that a post-carrier action can be reviewed, the nature of this incident with the potential to directly alter the result on the track merited a more immediate intervention. At least, that is what several teams and analysts thought, which began to raise their voice by questioning the consistency of the FIA criteria. In addition, Verstappen's gesture after the maneuver also left interesting readings. The Dutch did not show signs of concern. In fact, he continued his career without looking back, as if he knew there would be no consequences. That security, that poise, radically contrasted with Hamilton's silence, who barely issued radio comments during the following turns. Apparently focused, but also cold, almost calculating. What seemed like a simple overtaking maneuver was transformed, in a matter of minutes, in the center of all eyes. Because Hungary was not witnessing a simple duel on the track, it was the epicenter of an earthquake that still shakes the foundations of the 2025 season. And that was only the first act. What happened hours after the checkered flag in Hungaroring ended up being more disconcerting than Verstappen's own maneuver. When it was announced that the incident between the two pilots would be officially investigated by the career commissioners, the environment in the paddock was already loaded with tension. All the spotlights went to the Hall of the Commissioners waiting for a new chapter in this rivalry. But that chapter was never written in the way everyone imagined. This decision left analysts, media, and much of the paddock. Because it was not only a formal issue. In Formula One, appearing before the commissioners is not just a mandatory act. It is a strategic opportunity. It is the instance where you can influence the interpretation of the facts, show telemetrias, argue from the regulation, even appeal to precedents. And Hamilton discarded it completely. Neither he nor any Ferrari representative appeared to contribute his point of view. Only Red Bull sat in that room silently on the one hand, and with advantage on the other. What is also disturbing is Verstappen's alleged tactical interpretation during the maneuver. According to his own testimony to the commissioners, he would have left more space if Hamilton would have tried to stay on track, but as he was out, he chose to use the entire width of the curve. This phrase is revealing. It implies that the Red Bull driver, in full development of the maneuver, recognized Hamilton's absence in his rearview mirror and adapted his trace to maximize his advantage. There was no contact, yes, but it was also clear that Max pushed the limit, both physical and regulatory. And this is the turning point that generated the greatest controversy. A specific fact was not sanctioned, but that a maneuver that forced the rival to leave track was passed. Without contact, without damage, but with a clear affectation in the career result. An action that, according to some technical analysts, could set a dangerous precedent. Because if this form of defense is validated, then many pilots could take advantage of the ambiguity of the regulation to force rivals without the need for physical contact, trusting in the favorable interpretation of the commissioners. The final verdict left a feeling of vacuum, as if the incident had never existed. There was no extended explanation, telemetry data was not published, nor did the evolution of the trajectories detailed. There was also no follow-up on Hamilton's absence at the audience. The case was simply closed, as if time were to erase. As the waters of the Hungaroring scandal began to calm down on the surface, the underground currents inside Ferrari began to stir with an alarming force. Because while media attention focused on Verstappen's maneuver and Hamilton's reaction, the paddock halls and specialized forums began to circulate much more serious rumors. The possibility that Lewis Hamilton's car would have been modified without his consent before the classification session on Saturday. From the moment it was announced that the commissioners would review Verstappen's maneuver about Hamilton only after the end of the race, something already smelled of strategy. There were no radio calls from team directors demanding immediate action. No movement was seen in the control tower. It was as if the maneuver had no relevance until, suddenly, it began to be treated as an incident worthy of analysis. That abrupt change, without a clear trigger, showed a possible external pressure or an intention to protect interests greater than simple sports justice. But the real problem was not when, but how. The FIA announced the beginning of a formal investigation, but the process lacked fundamental elements. To start, only one of the Red Bull parts was heard. The other, Ferrari, was absent. And not for lack of involvement, but by unilateral decision of Hamilton and its surroundings. This omission, although legal, automatically weakened any possibility of balance in the analysis. In addition, the most relevant technical details of the incident were not publicly exposed. There was no detailed publication of comparative telemetry. There were no captures of the internal chamber angles, or precise data on the management and braking inputs of both pilots at the key time. Nor was no blunt evidence included about the pressure that Verstappen would have exerted on Hamilton on the margin of the path, which leaves the door open to multiple interpretations. Because in a championship as tight as that of 2025, an overtaking that forces the rival to lose position, rhythm and confidence, although it does not entail physical contact, has direct repercussions on the World Cup. The fact of not considering that sport's consequence in the analysis leaves an alarming vacuum in the F1 justice system. A void that other teams and pilots could begin to explode if they see that this type of maneuvers are unpunished. But what really turns on alarms is what was not investigated. The accusations of internal sabotage in Ferrari, the suspicions of unauthorized alterations in the Hamilton car, the possible conflicts within the team, all that was ignored. No boxes were reviewed. A report was not requested from the engineers involved. No data on the technical modifications between sessions were crossed. It was as if the focus of the investigation was carefully limited to the strictly visible track, leaving aside everything that could have deeper roots and more serious consequences. Not addressing those hidden layers of the conflict, the FIA not only lost an opportunity to show firmness and rigor, but also fed the narrative that certain decisions respond more to political calculations than to sports criteria. And that, in an era where Formula One seeks more and more credibility, professionalism and transparency, is a very dangerous setback. Hungary 2025 may have been the turning point to demonstrate that the category is above individual interests. But the lack of depth in research, the absence of answers to fundamental questions, and the deliberate omission of the most delicate technical and structural aspects made this opportunity a symptom. A symptom that, when the waters have too much cloud, the system prefers to cover them before swimming towards the bottom. And it is precisely there, in the background, where are the truths that have not yet been said. The questions that remain unanswered, and fractures that threaten this season in two. The FIA also has a debt to fans and with the teams themselves. The lack of transparency in its process, the superficiality of the analysis and the way in which the case was resolved without deepening the most sensitive technical aspects, feel a dangerous precedent. Because if these situations are not addressed with the rigor they deserve, the door opens to a new era of gray maneuvers, political decisions and institutional distrust. And now the big question is in the air. This was just an isolated episode, or the beginning of something much bigger? Could this be the turning point that ends up breaking the fragile coexistence between Hamilton and Ferrari? Are we at the gates of a greater scandal that has not yet finished exploding? We want to know your opinion. Do you think Hamilton did the right thing not to appear before the commissioners? Was it too aggressive or simply competitive? And what do you think of Ferrari's role in all this? Are we facing a new internal war that can change the course of the season? Leave it in the comments.